Making a battery interrupter with two connected wires. I've already shown you how to make a battery interrupter using two separate wires, but in this video I'm going to focus on using two wires that are connected. For this specific video, I'm going to use the leash that I cut off when I adapted this bunny. If you want to learn how to adapt this toy, as well as more about this battery interrupter and some other cool ideas, check out my website at playenabled.com and hit the subscribe button down below to stay up to date when I post new videos. Like I said, there are two ways to adapt this toy. The first way I show with the dog, which is hardwiring the remote on the leash. The second way is to create a battery interrupter. So when I adapted the bunny at first, what I actually did was I cut off the leash and did a little bit of hard wiring and then put a battery interrupter in. In that video, I mentioned that I think theoretically you could just hold down the button. So I actually ended up testing it, and you can. So you don't even need to cut all that off. So you can just turn the toy on and hold down the button on the leash and then put a battery interrupter in, and it will work. However, I didn't do that. I cut off the leash and used the leash to create a battery interrupter, and it also gave me some spare wire lying around for my next project. So assuming you went with the option that I show where you cut off the leash from the bunny and do a little bit of hard wiring, you will have excess wire that you can create a battery interrupter with. If not, you can also buy two wires that are connected on Amazon. So this video is going to show you the methods specifically for the leash, but also if you were to have purchased two wires that are connected. So let's get started with what you're going to need. You need the leash that you cut off from the bunny, or again, two connected wires that you bought on Amazon, a 3.5 millimeter female jack, a copper plate, solder, a soldering iron with a way to clean it, helping hands, tweezers, your tin snips or a pair of scissors, depending on what copper plate you go with, wire strippers, and these last two are optional, a mini screwdriver and heat shrink tube, and I explain why that's optional later. So for this video, I opened up the remote on the leash. However, you don't have to do this. You can just cut the remote off. That's why that screwdriver I mentioned earlier is optional, because you need it if you end up opening the remote. I did it this way because I wanted the switch inside the remote for a different project. If you end up just cutting it off, you're just going to have to repeat some of the steps I described, and I'll tell you when to do that. I take it out. Now you cut it down to size. When you're first starting out, I recommend that you cut it a little bit longer. That way if you make a mistake, you don't have to throw out the entire wire because it got too short. You can just cut off a few centimeters and use the rest of the wire. So you're going to cut it down to size, and then what you're going to do is, you're going to cut the wire to remove the casing. You want to do this cut in between the two inner wires, which you can see if you look at the tip. There's a green and red one in this one, and you're going to do a light cut. I did mine only about a ½ inch long, but if you are new at this, you can do a longer cut so that you don't have to worry about making a mistake, and also that way it would allow you to add some heat shrink tube. I didn't do a longer cut in this video because I've made tons of these. So then what I do is I use my fingernails to separate out the inner wires from the black casing. So then I'm going to strip the wires so I can attach them to the jack. What I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to cut down one of the wires so it's shorter. And the reason I want to do this is because these two wires are attached, having one shorter and one longer wire is going to make it easier to attach it to the jack. The long wire will go on the short pin, and the short wire will go on the tall pin. So now this is optional. It comes with 3 pins. It comes with 2 small ones and 1 large one. You don't need the 2 small ones. You only need one of those, so you can cut one off. You can also cut down the 2 wings on the tall pin. Now you're going to cut your copper plate. In doing this, especially with a thicker copper plate, you need to be careful because it's going to fly. So just make sure you have goggles or eye protection. Then you're going to cut it down a little bit more. The amount you cut it down is going to depend on the battery size. So once it's cut down, I'm going to grab my file and I'm going to kind of smooth out those rough edges from cutting it. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to take my tin snips, and at the top, I'm going to round the edges so that the wire won't accidentally sever on them. And then again, file it down so it's nice and smooth. I grab my jack and I grab my wires, and I'm going to thread the short wire through the tall pin, leaving a little bit exposed on both sides and twisting it together. So now I am going to check my long wire, twist it together, and thread it through. Then I'm going to leave a little exposed on both sides and bend it back. There's a little bit of a bend in the red wire. I could have stopped and stripped that wire a little bit more, but I decided not to. Now I'm going to solder it. You might notice that unlike my other video on how to make a battery interrupter, I did not add heat shrink tube to these two wires. The reason I didn't do that was because I actually cut these wires kind of short, and I wouldn't have had space to put the heat shrink tube on where it wouldn't accidentally be shrunk down by the heat of the soldering iron. You can cut the black casing a little bit more and pull the wires out a little farther so that you can have more exposed inner wires, and then put the heat shrink tube on like I do in my other videos. I just didn't do that in this video, and honestly I didn't have a reason. But if you're not doing it, you might need to add a little piece of electrical tape around each of the exposed wire to stop them from touching. If you do add the heat shrink tube, you might want to, in addition to the two pieces on each of the exposed wires, add a larger piece of heat shrink tube before you put the cover on, which I show here. So I'm going to twist the two wires at the end of the jack together and put the lid back on. So once I pull the lid up, I'm going to twist it into place. And I'm going to set this aside and prepare the copper plate. To do this, I'm going to put a dot of solder on one side of the copper plate. As you can see, it's a little farther down on the plate. I did this so I didn't accidentally have copper spilling over to the other side, because that would make it so the battery interrupter didn't work. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to want the dot of solder on the other side to be on the opposite side. And the reason I want to do this is that way it will separate out the wires a little bit more so that there's less likelihood of them accidentally touching and making it so the battery interrupt doesn't work. So again, I'm going to put a little bit of solder on there, somewhat farther down so that I don't accidentally run over to the other side. I'm going to let it cool down. And then I'm going to grab my jack. So with my jack, I have the two wires on the other side that I didn't strip. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to strip them. And I'm going to start at 22, which I know works because I did it for the other side. So I stripped the wires. Once they're stripped, I'm going to kind of twist them together. I'm going to do a process called tinning. And what tinning is it's adding a little bit of solder to the tips of a wire. This is really helpful, especially if you're doing more intricate soldering, because you don't have to worry that you're going to put too much solder on. Essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little solder on, and this way I can theoretically just heat up the solder on the copper plate as well as the solder on the wires, and I shouldn't need to add any more. However, it didn't really work out in this video because I ended up cutting it down too much and getting rid of the tinning. Here I am cleaning my solder real quickly. So everything's cooled down. So this is just a lot of maneuvering. You're going to need to kind of fidget with the pieces, and I cut down the exposed wire because it was a little long, and I'm just kind of fidgeting to get it in the right place. As you can see, I sped this up, but it is kind of frustrating and can be difficult sometimes. Almost in place, and I'm going to add my solder. So I ended up using a little more solder. I really shouldn't have. I should have, in hindsight, gotten my tweezers and held the wire in place, because the issue I was having is that once I picked up the solder, the wire moved. So I really should have been holding the wire into place. Also, as you can see, there's a little bit of the plastic cover, the green plastic cover on the copper plate. That's again going to cut down the likelihood of the wires getting crossed. So I cut the red one down a little bit and stripped it. That essentially got rid of the tinning I did. In hindsight, I shouldn't have done that. So I couldn't find my tweezers, so I grabbed a file, and I'm going to use that file to hold down the red wire to hopefully prevent some of the issues I had with the green wire. I'm not using my helping hands in this because I have a mat specifically that you can solder on. So there we go, I hold it down. When you hold it down, just make sure you don't accidentally solder your tweezers onto the board. And there you go, your battery interrupter using 2 connected wires is now complete. If you like what you saw and want information on how to adapt other things, check out my website at playenabled.com.